right, hello everyone, good morning. So we know that Facebook and Australia got into a bit of a fight not too long ago. The details of this fight are still a little bit unknown. There's definitely obfuscation, maybe on both sides. So, Libby, I want to hear your thought initially. What happened in this scrap between Facebook and news publishers in Australia?
In Australia, the Regulatory Commission, the ACCC, became concerned about the impact of huge platforms, namely Google and Facebook, the impact they were having on news media content creation, and more importantly, the public interest of informed discourse. So they did research and they found that indeed there was an adverse impact on the amount of news content being produced after the Facebook and Google came to Australia. So then they introduced a bill which would basically force designated platforms to negotiate pay programs with the news media content providers. So they introduced this. Google and Facebook lost their minds. They didn't want this. They said it didn't apply to them. Google said they would shut down Search. Facebook said they would shut down Facebook. And what happened is in February of last year, they went ahead and did that. After the bill was passed in their House and going to their Senate, Facebook shut down for 5 days. And when they shut down, they didn't limit it to just news media pages. They shut down more than 17,000 pages, including emergency services, domestic violence, fire during bushfire season, and even the health system just 4 days before the rollout of the vaccines. And they did this for negotiating leverage because they wanted the language in the legislation to be watered down to give them the chance of not being designated. So what happened is they got what they wanted in terms of amendments, and then they turned it all back on. Now, at the time, this was a huge crisis in the country, right? Nobody could do what they needed to do. So many people were in danger. I mean, imagine domestic violence victims and all of that. So basically, Facebook was like, oh, this was accidental, it was inadvertent, and our clients, the whistleblowers that came forward, brought forward evidence demonstrating that it wasn't accidental, it wasn't inadvertent. There were lots of signals that this whole thing was deliberate and a choice made, and at the end, the leadership congratulated itself for precision execution.
Right, and so just so I make sure I have the facts of this case correct, Australia tried to get Facebook to pay for news. Facebook said, we're not paying for news, and ended up blocking news sites, ended up blocking a bunch of other sites like the ones you mentioned, important government services. But then, Facebook still ended up paying $200 million or something reported in that ballpark to news publishers. So, who extorted who? Because, I mean, of course Facebook made these moves to block all these different pieces of content, but at the end of the day, news publishers still, working with legislators, got a ton of money from Facebook. Jason, so how do you help us understand how to square those two pieces of fact?
You know, I certainly push back on the idea that news publishers won anything that they hadn't already deserved, right? Like there was $200 million roughly of reported revenue that the news publishers in Australia are now getting from Google and Facebook. A lot more of it reportedly from Google than Facebook. It seems Google understands its role better in terms of civil society. But there were multiple years of investigations that led up to this law that showed the clear imbalance in bargaining power between these two platforms and the press, and a recognition that the press is critically important to civil society. And so, you know, that lead-in is important because where Australia ended up was either we need to do something to help correct this imbalance in bargaining power in the short term, or we need these companies to be broken up or do something more structural, which, you know, a country like Australia can't do on its own. The US certainly could make that move, and they're attempting to do it right now with Facebook. And so it was a short-term solution to right the ship in terms of the imbalance of bargaining power, and it survived, some pretty egregious conduct by Facebook that I think anybody would look at and say, I didn't know that company, Facebook of all companies, could even be that unethical to do that behavior. So, and I think ultimately what Facebook and Google were really trying to accomplish was to keep that law in Australia, isolate it as this crazy law down in Australia so that other countries wouldn't start following suit and actually see that it works.
Yeah, I understand Facebook's position where it was like, okay, you want us to pay the news publishers, you must not think that the news publishers are getting any value out of this. And so we're going to block news publishers, and then we see who wants us to pay and who doesn't. However, you start getting into blocking government organizations, maybe hospitals, other key health information, and it makes you scratch your head, what the hell's going on here? Nate, when you saw that, sitting where you sit as a member of the government here in Canada, what went through your head?
Honestly, it wasn't that surprising in some ways because we had dealt directly with Facebook at our privacy committee in relation to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and we'd gone down a bit of a rabbit hole alongside partners in the UK, and the conduct of Facebook in the course of that particular scandal was, there's a lack of transparency, to put it as politely as I can, and so it wasn't surprising to see how they dealt with the Australian government and the Australian Parliament. Obviously lessons learned in the Canadian context because we looked at that, and to Jason's point of wanting to keep the law in Australia, well, it hasn't stayed in Australia, and we've had the similar challenges in Canada with a news industry that has really struggled, and we have similar legislation now modeled on Australia's to ensure that there's a fairer balance with respect to bargaining.
I'm kind of struck by this because on one hand, I understand that Facebook has become this really important aggregator. If you want to reach an audience, you might want to go through Facebook. But didn't the news industry become over-reliant on Facebook to the point where Facebook could end up creating so much value from the work that they do and capturing almost all that value? Is it time for the news organization to insulate itself, for the news industry to insulate itself from this sort of pressure and find ways to free itself from Facebook? I thought maybe it should just, okay, we saw what's happening here, maybe the news industry should just withdraw completely and find ways to make money outside of Facebook, because they need it too much. What do you think, Jason?
For sure. I mean, that's, the promise of Facebook being this new platform that would build up assets for news organizations, that started to fail in like 2017, 2018 as Facebook repeatedly pulled the rug out from under news organizations with things like the move to video that was kind of a false presentation of facts. So there was lots of lessons along the way for publishers, and they know they needed to be less reliant on the company. I think it's important to understand that underneath that imbalance in bargaining power was a lot more than just the news showing up on Facebook. It was that Facebook collects data across most of the internet and the app ecosystem, and they're able to use their market power in ways that you might not see just with a news story on the platform that they can exert for financial gains. There's a reason they have $130 billion of revenue globally. It's not just because of what appears on their news feed.
So what you're saying is no matter what publishers do, they're still going to be subject in some way to the amount of power that Facebook has.
Absolutely.
Libby, I want to hear from your perspective about some of these moves that Facebook made. We should spend a minute focusing on it, right? So we talk about the blocking of news organizations. Okay, in a vacuum, that sort of makes sense. But then they expanded much further, and the documents that the whistleblowers that your organization worked with showed was that after this happened, I think understanding how far it went and the fact that they went so broad, Facebook executives still congratulated each other on the move and said it was a thoughtful and well-executed plan in Australia. So can you help us understand inside Facebook what the reaction was and whether you think that they'll use similar tactics if they're as happy as they are?
Well, I think it's really important to look at the anomalies in the execution of this takedown inside Facebook. There were a lot of indicators that choices were made to maximize the leverage of the shutdown. They didn't have a canary process before they rolled it out, which is a testing process to see how the algorithm's going to work precisely or not. They didn't do cross-checks with sensitive name lists, which is something that they always do because they don't like to have over-inclusive shutdowns of potentially important influential people. They did not have an appeals process ready to roll, and even their alarm system, their internal alarm system that went off and showed that they were over-inclusive, it didn't trigger automatic rollbacks. So all of these things that are built into events at Facebook did not take place for this particular event, even though the impact was enormous.
Now, Nate, you have a bill that's going to basically do similar things as Australia tried to do in regards to these companies. That's correct.
Yeah, so we have a piece of legislation that is, a few pieces of legislation actually that are trying to be a little more forward-thinking with respect to technology and how we take some of the values and principles that have existed previously in some of these industries and apply them going forward. And so the bill in particular is C18, but it is modeled on Australia and is really, the goal there is to support the news ecosystem, but by leveling the playing field fundamentally.
So you just heard what Libby talked about in terms of how Facebook pushed back when Australia made these moves. You want to go up against that?
I don't think we will see that. We haven't seen that fairly in the Canadian context yet. And I say that, I think, when we look at lessons learned, we're learning lessons from other parliaments and other jurisdictions. I think Facebook probably learned their lesson because I don't think the public reaction was one that they wanted to see ultimately.
But they're happy. Clearly from those documents, they're pumped about what happened.
Yeah, but it's the same. Look, in the EU many years ago, they updated their privacy rules and data protection rules via the GDPR. And at that time, some of the big tech companies spent a lot of money lobbying against those rules. We're going to have similar updates coming as well. There was another bill that was tabled in Parliament recently. My industry committee will be dealing with it in the coming year. And I guarantee that we're not going to see the same kind of pushback because they don't want to spend that same sum of money and effort knowing that it's a losing cause. They're going to make it work. It might not be perfect for them, but they're going to make it work.
What have your conversations been like with Facebook and Google at this point? Are they willing to pay ball and pay publishers money for the news that shows up on their platforms?
So the bill C18 that is setting out to level the playing field, I think they're willing to play ball. I don't think they're particularly happy. So you've seen Facebook when they testified at committee saying we would have liked to have been more consulted and we don't agree with this and we don't agree with that, but they aren't going to war with the legislation, with the government in a way that they did in Australia.
Give us a timetable. How long do you think it might be till this thing passes?
Till it passes?
Because if it's soon, I might have to start a publication in Canada.
I would say we've got two pieces of legislation. One is to ensure that online streaming services are paying into Canadian content creation. The second bill in relation to the news media ecosystem. And we're going to see both of those pieces of legislation become law, I would expect, within the year. Within the next 12 months. Yeah, it's got to get through the Senate still, but we haven't had the same trouble in the House, so I would expect there to be a reasonable pathway there. And then the privacy and data protection legislation is newer and tabled more recently, so I would expect we see that come through at least the House sometime in the next 12 months.
Jason, you're deeply involved in the legislative process in the US, especially when it comes to regulating these digital platforms like Facebook. Talk about the tactics that they use that people might not be aware of in terms of shooting down bills they don't like and how that might come into play in this situation and others.
Yeah, in the US right now, there's some very important antitrust legislation that's close to being put to the floor, and it should pass if it does. And they're spending tens of millions of dollars through, somewhat transparent organizations to what we call AstroTurf organizations, where you don't even know that they're behind them. And so it's a different scale, I think, in the US in terms of the money being thrown around. But I think the important thing for everyone to realize in the audience is that, the good actors that are out there that are trying to get the facts out of what's really happening, which I expect from our parliamentarians, I expect it from the press, that they're trying to make sure they're transparent about what's happening, are going up against a network of many times disinformation folks that are actually trying to create confusion about what these laws really do. And so you've got narratives in the US that are very, deceptive around what the antitrust laws are going to do that are, I think, unfair. There was reporting in Canada that Google had actually offered to pay for a lobbyist for a organization that pretended to represent news publishers and Google had actually offered to pay the salary of that lobbyist to work on behalf of news publishers. So, you know, that was the report, and those are the types of tactics that I'm familiar with.
I just want to ask the big picture question here. If I'm a news publisher, I'm getting traffic from Facebook and Google. Now I might be getting money from Facebook and Google. Why don't I like Facebook and Google?
You do like them if they start to pay real money. You know, if you take 200 million in Australia and you apply that to the US, you're thinking billions of dollars, and you literally have, you know, 20–30% of your newsroom that can now be subsidized in a different way. And your biggest threat then is making sure you maintain your independence. But publishers have always had to do that with the government and other powerful actors.
Isn't the risk here, though, that these companies start to rethink the whole thing and say, we're not going to do news anymore? Facebook might say, we don't want any more news links. They've already minimized the amount of news links in the feed. Nate, are you worried about that when you put legislation forward?
I would say we have to think about what the public interest is here. And the public interest for me, when I consider it, is ensuring that we have local civic media, and we ensure that and local civic news and local civic journalism. And so, is this going to be a silver bullet? No. Will it level the playing field, make things more fair? But at the end of the day, you have advertisers that can pay for news, you have governments that can pay for news, you have the private sector that can pay for news, and you have sort of benevolent benefactors that can pay for news. At the end of the day, you have to sit down and say, if this is the public interest and this is what we want to support, we're going to have to find as many ways to support as we can.
All right, Libby, let's end with you. We have all these laws that end up coming and trying to regulate tech companies. They don't really care. So when it comes to enforcement, what do you think the most effective way to enforce this is? And if you still have time, because we got a minute left, are we going to see similar legislation like this in the US or countries elsewhere, or is it going to be limited to places like Australia and Canada?
It's definitely been offered already in the US, so I think that, you know, it's got fair play. I think that Western democracies are all going to look to model after these laws. So when the EU does GRP and Australia does the news content law, I think it benefits everybody. And because the platforms have to comply in those jurisdictions, it's easier for them to comply across the platform than to pick. But I think that as the legislators move, they really need to think about enforcement.
Thinking about it, Nate?
Well, when I think about the sort of international context and making sure that we're all learning from one another, I sit on not only the industry committee in Canada, but also the International Grand Committee, a collection of sort of 10 plus parliaments around the world. And I can say on antitrust issues, I've learned from my American colleagues. On data protection and privacy issues, I've learned from my EU colleagues. I certainly have seen what's happened in Australia that's informed the Canadian approach. So we all just need to learn from one another. I think our election interference laws, others have learned from us here in Canada. So I think we're better off when we learn from international experiences.
All right, well, Nate, Jason, Libby, thank you so much. What a great discussion, and thanks to you, an amazing audience. Have a great rest of your day here at Collision, and let's wrap it up there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.